I want you to picture the moment you realize that the woman who raised you has spent years quietly choosing someone else over you. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way anyone else would notice at first. But in the small, steady, accumulating way that builds like water behind a dam until one day the dam simply breaks and everything you thought you understood about your family comes rushing out all at once. And that was my wedding day. And my name is Renata, and I am 34 years old, and I planned my wedding for 14 months. 14 months of venue calls and cake tastings, and seating chart revisions and dress fittings, and flower consultations, and rehearsal dinner logistics. 14 months of building something I had dreamed about since I was a little girl sitting in my grandmother's garden watching the light come through the rose bushes and imagining what it would feel like to walk towards someone who chose me. And I chose ivory for my wedding dress, not white, ivory, a very specific shade of warm cream with the faintest blush undertone that my dress designer Miriam described as champagne kissed with first light. It cost me $4,000 to $100, and I saved for it for 2 years. I tried on 43 dresses before I found it. I cried in the fitting room. My best friend Cecile cried too. It was the dress. There was no question. And every guest received a formal invitation that included a small card. On that card, an elegant printed script it read, "Out of respect for the bride, we kindly ask that guests refrain from wearing white, cream, ivory, or any shade thereof. This is a firm request, and we thank you for your grace and understanding." And I was not being precious. I was being clear. There is a difference. And my sister Donnie is 28 years old, and she has been my mother's favorite since the day she was born. I do not say that with bitterness anymore. I used to. I spent a long time being bitter about it, but I have done enough therapy and enough quiet sitting with myself to understand that it is simply true in the way some things are simply true. The sky is blue, winter is cold. Donnie is our mother's favorite. It does not mean I am unloved. It means there's a particular warmth my mother reserves for Donnie that she has never quite turned fully in my direction. And my mother's name is Sylvia. She is 61 years old, and she is a beautiful woman who has always cared deeply about appearances, not in a cruel way, in the way that women of a certain generation were taught to care, the way that made her press our dresses before school and always have the right thing to say at dinner parties and never let anyone see her cry except in the car on the way home. And 6 weeks before my wedding, my mother called me at Tuesday evening. I was making pasta, and I had flour on my hands, and I answered without thinking. And she said she wanted to talk about the wedding. I said, of course. She said she had a little surprise for Donnie. I felt something shift in my stomach, but I kept my voice pleasant. I asked what kind of surprise. She said she had taken Donnie shopping. I waited. She said she had found the most stunning gown for her to wear to the wedding. I asked what color. And there was a pause. And she said it was more of an antique shade, elegant, classic, very tasteful. And I set down my pasta spoon. And I asked her to describe the color more specifically. And she said it was somewhere between ivory and champagne. Very subtle, barely noticeable. And I told her that was ivory. I told her the invitation specifically asked guests not to wear ivory. I told her my dress was ivory. And she said I was being sensitive. She said no one would even notice. She said Donnie had already fallen in love with the dress, and it would break her heart not to wear it. And I asked how much the dress cost. And another pause, and she said it was on sale. And I asked how much, and she said $6,500. And I sat down on my kitchen floor. And my mother had spent $6,500 on an ivory dress for my sister to wear to my wedding, after I had specifically asked that no one wear ivory, after I had spent 14 months planning every detail, after I had saved for 2 years to buy my own dress. And I said very calmly that Donnie would not be wearing that dress to my wedding. And my mother said I was being unreasonable, and I said I was being the bride. And she said I was making a mountain out of nothing. And I said goodbye, and I hung up the phone, and I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. And what happened next is the part people always want to hear. But I need you to understand the part that came before, because the part that came before is the whole story really. And I called my fiancé Marcus that night. Marcus is a gentleman with a loud laugh and very steady hands, and he has always been able to see situations from a height I cannot always reach on my own. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life, and he said, "Renata, you have spent your whole life adjusting yourself so that your mother and your sister can be comfortable. What would happen if just this once you did not adjust?" And I thought about that for 3 days, and I called my wedding coordinator, Petra. Petra has been doing this for 22 years, and she has seen everything. I explained the situation to her quietly and precisely. She did not gasp. She did not express outrage. She simply asked me what I wanted to happen, and I told her, and she said she could make that happen, and we put a plan in place. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel. It was simply a boundary with a consequence attached to it, the way all real boundaries work. And I called my mother 2 weeks before the wedding. I told her that I loved her and I was glad she would be at my wedding, and I needed her to know that Donnie would not be permitted to enter the venue in an ivory dress. I told her this was not negotiable. I told her I had spoken to the venue coordinator, and there would be staff at the entrance who were aware of the situation. I told her I was not angry. I was simply clear. And my mother said I was punishing Donnie for nothing. And I said I was protecting my wedding day. And she said Donnie would be devastated. And I said I hoped Donnie would choose a different dress. And she said I was cold. And I said goodbye, and I told her I would see her at the rehearsal dinner. And the rehearsal dinner was fine. Donnie wore a navy blue dress and did not look at me for most of the evening. My mother was pleasant in the brittle way she gets when she is holding something back. Marcus gave a speech that made everyone laugh, and his grandmother held my hand under the table for most of the night, and I felt for a moment like everything might actually be okay. And my wedding morning was one of the most beautiful mornings of my life. I woke up in the hotel suite Cecile had booked for us, and the lights was coming through the curtains in long gold strips, and I could hear birds outside, and I just lay there for a few minutes breathing. Just breathing, being 34 years old, and in love and about to get married on a day I had planned for 14 months. And Cecile and my other 2 bridesmaids, Odette and Fern, were there, and we had coffee and pastries, and we played music and got our hair done, and I got into my dress, and I stood in front of the mirror, and I looked like myself, fully myself, in champagne kissed with first light. And Petra called me at 9:47 in the morning. Her voice was completely even. She said she wanted to let me know that Donnie had arrived at the venue. And I asked what she was wearing, and Petra said she was wearing the ivory gown. And I closed my eyes, and Petra said the security staff and the venue coordinator were at the gate, and that Donnie had been informed she would not be permitted to enter in that dress. She said my mother was with Donnie and was currently speaking with the venue coordinator. She asked if I wanted her to handle it or if I wanted to be involved, and I said please handle it. I said, I trust you completely, and Petra said she would take care of everything and that I should enjoy my morning. And I put down the phone, and Cecile looked at me. I told her what had happened. She nodded slowly, and then she poured me more coffee and put on a song I love, and that was that. And what I learned afterward came in pieces over the following days, and Donnie had arrived in the ivory dress, not ivory adjacent, not a borderline shade. The full $6,500 gown my mother had bought her. She had arrived in it deliberately. She had looked at every piece of information available to her, including my phone call to my mother, the invitation card, and 2 weeks of knowing exactly what would happen, and she had worn it anyway. And the security staff at the gate were 2 large-com professional men named Jerome and David, who Petra had briefed thoroughly. They had greeted Donnie, and my mother politely and explained that per the bride's instructions, guests wearing white Cream or Ivory were not permitted to enter. They offered Donnie options. There was a shop 2 blocks from the venue. There was time before the ceremony. They could hold her bag and her things if she wanted to step away and find something else. And my mother apparently argued for 11 minutes. 11 minutes of explaining that this was her daughter, that the dress was not truly Ivory, that I was being ridiculous, that this was a family matter. Jerome and David listened respectfully and held their position the entire time. And Donnie did not go to the shop, and she went back to her car. And she and my mother sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. And then my mother came inside alone, wearing the green dress she had arrived in under a coat, and she sat in the 3rd row. And she watched me marry Marcus, and she cried. And I do not know exactly what those 40 minutes in the parking lot looked like. I do not know what my mother and my sister said to each other. I know that my mother came inside and my sister did not, and I know that when my mother found me at the reception, she held my face in her hands for a long moment before she said anything. And what she said was, "You looked beautiful." And that was all. And it was not an apology. But it was something. From Sylvia, it was something. And I want to tell you about the ceremony, because the ceremony is the part that matters most to me. And the venue was a restored estate with a garden and an old stone arch and the kind of afternoon lake. HT that photographers describe as magic hour, but which really just looks like the world deciding to be its most beautiful. Marcus stood under the arch with his brother and his best friend from college. And when I came through the doors on my father's arm, Marcus looked at me the way I have always wanted someone to look at me, and not like I was something to be impressed by, like I was something he recognized, like I was the person he had been looking for, and now I was here and everything made sense. And we wrote our own vows. I will not share all of them because they belong to us, but I will tell you that Marcus said, "I choose you on the easy days, and the difficult days, and the days when being chosen feels like the whole world." And I said, "I spent a long time learning to take up the right amount of space. Thank you for making a space that is exactly my size." And we cried. The officiant cried. Cecile cried. Marcus's grandmother cried so hard she had to be fanned by her niece. And it was the best moment of my life. And the reception was beautiful. The food was extraordinary. The dancing went until midnight. Marcus and I danced to a song we had picked together on a rainy afternoon 6 months earlier, sitting on his kitchen floor eating takeout and going through playlists and laughing at all the wrong choices until we found the right one. And my mother stayed the whole evening. She was not warm with me exactly, but she was present, and she danced with my father, and she complimented Cecile on her speech, and she ate the salmon and the wedding cake, and she left. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Drive safe," even though Marcus and I were staying at the hotel. And it was an ordinary thing to say, but she said it like she meant it. And Donnie texted me at 11:15 that night. The text said, "I hope it was everything you wanted." And I looked at the text for a long time, and I wrote back, "It was," and I have not heard from her since. It has been for months. I do not know when I will. I do not know if the distance between us is permanent or temporary or something in between. I know that something shifted that day in a way I cannot fully articulate. Something about what I am willing to absorb in the name of keeping the peace. Something about the difference between loving your family and disappearing inside the accommodations you make for them. And people have asked me if I regret it, if I wish I had just let it go, let Donnie wear the dress, kept the peace, moved on. And I understand why they ask. I understand the impulse to smooth things over, to prioritize harmony, to decide that the dress is just a dress and it does not matter. But here is what I want to say to that. And the dress was not just a dress. And the dress was my mother spending $6,500 to dress my sister in the exact color I had asked no one to wear to my wedding. The dress was my sister arriving in it anyway after 2 weeks of knowing what would happen. The dress was 14 months of planning into years of saving and a lifetime of quietly making room for other people, meeting the moment where I finally did not make room. And the dress was the question of whether I would spend my wedding day the way I had spent so many other days, adjusting, softening, accommodating, shrinking. And I did not. And I stood in front of the mirror in my champagne-kissed with first light gown, and I walked through those doors, and I married Marcus in the garden under the stone arch in the afternoon. Magic our light, and I took up exactly the right amount of space, and Marcus and I went to Portugal for our honeymoon. We stayed in a small house near the coast with terracotta floors and a lemon tree in the courtyard, and we woke up every morning to the sound of the ocean. We cooked simple dinners and walked along the water and read books and slept long and deep and peaceful. And on our third evening there we sat on the back steps as the sun went down, and Marcus asked me how I felt. Not about the wedding drama, about everything, about where I was, and I thought about it for a while, and then I said, I feel like myself, and he nodded like that was exactly the right answer. And because it was, and my mother called me last month on a Sunday afternoon, we talked for 40 minutes about ordinary things, the weather, a show she had been watching, my father's new hobby of making bread. At the end of the call she said she had been thinking about the wedding, and I waited. And she said, you were very organized about it. And I said, thank you. And she said, your dress was lovely. And I said, thank you again. And there was a pause. And then she said, I think I should have handled some things differently. And I did not push. I did not ask her to elaborate. I did not need her to say more than she was able to say. I know my mother. I know what that cost her. I know what lives in the space between what she means and what she is able to say out loud. And I said, I love you, Mom. And she said, I love you too, sweetheart. And that was enough. Not everything, not a full reckoning, not the conversation I might have written in my head in the dark years of feeling invisible in my own family, but something real and something hers and something given freely. And that is where we are, cautiously rebuilding, slowly, like people who have agreed to try again without quite naming what we are trying again from. And I do not know what Donnie and I will become. I hope we find our way back to something. I hope the $6,500 ivory dress becomes eventually just a story we tell with some rueful laughter and distance. I hope she one day has something she cares about so completely that she understands why I did what I did, and but I also know that I cannot care about that more than she does. I cannot build a bridge from both ends on my own. And what I can do is keep taking up the right amount of space. Keep standing clearly inside the life I am building. Keep choosing Marcus, and the terracotta floors, and the lemon tree, and the long peaceful sleep, and the feeling of being fully seen by someone who looked at me coming through the doors and recognized me. And I walked toward that, arms open, champagne, kissed with first light, and the day was exactly mine.